Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the sixth and final webinar in the Condatis series on identity using B2C. As with previous webinars, we'll have a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to post any questions as we go through and we'll attempt to tackle them at the end. My name is David Manning. I'm an architect with Condatis, and I've been involved in the design and delivery of B2C-based solutions for the past 3 years. In the previous webinars in this series, we've introduced B2C, what it is, what it does, and how it does it. We've covered the basics. We've built on B2C's capabilities, covering the use of policy hierarchies. We've talked about the application of consistent branding across user journeys, both on web pages and in emails. We've talked about integration with external systems such as CRMs. We've talked about different user types, the need to support federation, perhaps for staff access or for social accounts. And we've talked about different types of credentials, including multi-factor authentication, SMS texts, authenticated apps, for example, either as an initial strong authentication or as a step up within a user journey. And most recently, we discussed conditional access and the application of risk scoring to detect unusual usage patterns and to take action against potentially fraudulent use. Today, we're going to put the previous learnings into perspective by discussing Condatis' experience of using B2C and delivering client systems. As the company that delivered the first UK production system using B2C for Nuffield Health, we can describe our experience from the days of early adopters through the changes in the products to where we are today and where we see identity moving in the future. To that end, we have Chris Eckel with us today. Chris is our Chief Technology Officer, and he's the man who has been present throughout the evolution of the B2C product. Chris can give us some of the history of the use of the product. He can describe some of the particularly useful advances that we've seen over the past few years, and he can highlight some of the changes that we're now seeing in the identity space. We also have our Head of Accounts, Ian Waters. Ian can give us an insight into some of the requirements that we're seeing regularly with our clients and prospective customers, particularly when related to larger scale systems and the reasons for companies wanting to implement a common identity and access management system to support their services. And as always, we have Dave Downs. Dave is one of our senior developers who's been at the sharp end of delivering B2C-based solutions, and he's the man who's talked us through a set of worked examples in the past webinars. So Dave can give us some further insight into some of the challenges that we faced in delivering larger, more complex systems for some of our clients. So, Chris, can you get us started?
Oh, thanks, David. Great to have this fantastic panel of Condatis experts on identity assembled. What I'd like to try is pick out a number of important topics that make up digital identity, and with the help of you, the panelists, explore and learn more about customer identity, learn from your experience and success, and learn from the successes from existing case studies. Digital identity connects organizations with their customers. Organizations want to understand their customers and be able to digitally connect them to as many of their services as possible. Digital identity isn't more than connecting somebody live on the other side of a keyboard with a digital service, with this digital anchor. It is just this anchor, but how we implement it. At Condatis, we have a great examples from the past where we helped our customers and their organizations to achieve this. So, Ian, let's get started on this topic on why is it actually important to unify one's customer's digital identity story?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, it's a really good question. There's a number of reasons why organizations might want to unify their customer identities, but I guess there's two key drivers that we see more often than not, and it's growth, it's customer growth, revenue growth, and it's to enhance security. They're the two that we see. So I think when we're looking for most organizations, as I say, growth's the number one goal, it's the number one business goal. And at the larger scale, at the enterprise level, government level, organizations, where they're looking at mergers, acquisitions, they're finding that they're running into issues around siloed identity, because as you bring these different product lines and services together, that then becomes a constraint to further grow. So quite often then you want to have that unified customer identity to unlock that growth potential. So if we look back at Nuffield Health, our very first customer, as David said at the top there, it was actually growth that was identified as the number one business requirement that that Nuffield, were prioritizing around customer identity and access management. And we then went and engaged with Nuffield and helped them. So when we first started talking to that client, they had multiple shop windows, as they referred to them, and siloed identity provisioning. So like many that have followed since Nuffield, they essentially proposed that unifying their customer identity and having a single, if you like, front door, digital door to all of their products and services, hooked up with a CRM system, would essentially unlock that growth potential, and surprise, surprise, it has.
Thanks, Ian. Highlighting growth as one of this first concept that's really the driver for why we need unified customer identity. David, from your experience, what does this mean to the approach we need to take?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. As we've heard, identity sits at the heart of an access management system. So it's really important to understand the context in which the system will operate. Often our clients deal with individuals accessing their services, so it's important to understand the services on offer and the level of identity assurance required, to have confidence that they know who they're dealing with, and the level of authentication required to protect access to their services, either to protect sensitive data or even just to ensure that only paying customers can access the service. But our clients also often deal with organizations, either as partners or as groups of end customers, and that requires some additional effort to group them together and apply access rights at the group level. So providing a unified solution allows the service provider to keep track of the different clients and varying access rights in a single place. That makes it easier to manage. We also see regular requests for staff access to, for example, allow service desk users to gain access to client data, and that allows them to provide quality customer service. So that might require federation against an existing staff system, for example. So we often help to develop an identity strategy in partnership with our clients to understand the services on offer, the number of users, the type of users they have, the source of storage of their customer data, to ensure that the customer's needs can be met in an efficient and a user-friendly manner. And as Ian's just mentioned, we've also got to consider growth potential. So ensuring that the resultant system's capable of scaling to meet increased volumes, capable of being enhanced to tackle new requirements, either through addition of new services organically or as part of a merger. And that often comes with its own challenges around migration of users, which I'm sure we'll touch on later in this session. And it's this need for the ability to support large user bases, potentially different user types, different access control demands made by disparate service lines, all handled by a single system that seems to play to B2C strengths. So Dave, we've talked in previous sessions about some of the B2C capabilities. Can you pick out some of the key aspects that are particularly important when dealing with the demands of large-scale solutions and disparate service needs?
Yeah, so as we've touched on in the previous months, right, in the other webinars, it's really about your B2C policy design and the structure of how you put in your policies together. That's the key thing, that's the core of this system, because they're what you're using to standardize your authentication across the various different services and to centralize all of your authentication journey logic. So they need to be maintainable and they need to be expandable. They generally grow either up or out to accommodate the different services and the different scenarios in large systems initially, but also as systems grow. So when the policies are growing up, that tends to be variations of a journey. So maybe you've got a standard sign-in, a standard way of doing your sign-in, or a standard way of doing your registration, but different services want something slightly different out of it. Maybe they want a different kind of token, or maybe one supports OpenID Connect, the other one supports SAML. There you might have one core policy that does the sign-up, does the sign-in, but then different variations on that just change the format of the response or the token. Growing out tends to be you've got completely different journeys, or at least significant enough changes to your core journey so that those policies live side by side. So that might be you've got a separate sign-up journey, you've got a separate sign-in journey, user profile, rights elevation, etc., etc., etc. Whatever you need your policies to do. So you need to have that in mind when you're designing your policies, that you're going to want them to grow in potentially different directions, and you've got to design them and arrange everything in such a way that makes that easy for you. So we were talking about Nuffield. We designed some policies for Nuffield to do registration via email invitation and registration just with a standard, enter your user details, sign me up for the first time registration form. Now that's a decent example of policies growing out, right? You've got your main registration flow, and then a flow that's also a registration, but it's different enough. You maybe don't need to capture all the user details. You're expecting an invitation code to come in that needs to be verified, that needs to contact some other system to, look up the user details that we're expecting for that user, and so on and so on and so on. So you expand out that way. Similarly, we also did one where we've got the regular sign-in flow, but there's variations for email address and phone number. The overall flow remains the same, so maybe that's a single policy that defines how you sign in with an email address, but there's a phone variation, so we just capture the phone number and then maybe do a little bit of different validation for that. So that would perhaps be growing up rather than out. You've got other projects that might disable registration for one of the services. So maybe you've got a combined sign-in and sign-up flow, a number of different services that all use that to authenticate with. One of them doesn't want to allow the user to register. So for that one particular service, it overrides that policy, extends it upwards to say, when you get to the particular registration step, just block the user, don't allow them to register. So you've got to have in mind, what's your system, what are your users going to be doing, and how is it likely to grow in the future, all of which come together to start helping you understand how you're going to build out your policies. Once you've got kind of your structure to your journey together, you've also got to consider the fact that you want to centralize your data as well. Now, that might not be a case of actually physically putting everything in the same place. It might just be a case of bringing together disparate data sources as part of your authentication journey to build up a token at the end. So you might have your authentication data in B2C, you might have personal information in your CRM, you might integrate with something like Salesforce or Dynamics or SQL Server or any other store to get things like eligibility information or rights access, that kind of stuff. And you'd have your policies bring all of that together to then present a single token to the user at the end, to the relying party, to the service, to say, this is who this user is, this is what I know about them based on that data, they have these access rights. So then the services don't need to know that you've got half a dozen different backend systems, they just interact with B2C. So it's about knowing how all of your services connect or can connect together as part of B2C, how that fits in with your policies, where that fits into the journey to build up a consistent journey through so that the user gets just one way of interacting with the service. You're centralizing user information and your authentication all in one place. Now, to go with that, you've also got to consider scaling, right? Because your system's going to grow over time. Maybe it starts out at a certain size, maybe it grows. At some point, scaling is probably going to come into it. Now, the core of B2C, that's already engineered by Microsoft for scale. So you don't really need to focus on how am I going to scale my policies, how am I going to scale the user directory. Instead, you can focus on the various different components that you want to add to customize the journey. So all of these different components that are going out to Access SQL or Access Dynamics, or whatever it is that they're doing, how am I scaling those? So you can engineer your architecture and your code of those components for performance according to your need. So you consider things like, where's the system going to be accessed from? What are your usage patterns? What's the hot paths through the system? And just what are your performance requirements? And then you engineer your different components that feed into B2C around that. So that might be, designing your network infrastructure, you're figuring out your resource scaling requirements, any caching, identifying anything that could be an asynchronous call. So maybe some things could go on an event bus because you don't need it to happen as part of the main authentication journey. All of that combined together, along with your performance testing, helps you build this kind of larger scalable system. Some systems are going to fit in a single region. Others are going to have to be the multi-region, highly scalable, fully traffic managed with failover when components fail. The exact implementation is going to depend on the requirements of your system, right? Not all systems are the same, but B2C is flexible enough, the policies are flexible enough that it's all possible depending on whatever your requirements actually are.
Wow, thanks for this great elaboration on the options and challenges of scaling. And thanks to the rest of the panel. Very interesting to explore those different business perspectives of the scaling topic. Fascinating how the topics of growing and scaling are already emerging, and how scaling affects how to bring this data together for this unified identity service that is then adoptable by all the customer services. So great. Now let's look at the aspect of security and risk. Identity naturally falls in most organizations into this topic of cybersecurity. It's usually protected in a what they call tier 0 service, with tier 0 really being those fundamental highest protectable assets of an organization, like certificate authorities. So naturally, organizations are really concerned with the security of the customer account, because we hear daily of hacks, breaches, data leakages. Ian, I'm sure it's not different for our customers, is it?
You're absolutely right, Chris. And I think organizational security and protecting that customer data are areas that we see companies taking very seriously at the moment. As you say, especially as we see these reports almost on a daily, weekly basis of large, well-known organizations being breached. I guess, as they say in the security circles, it's not a case of if you're going to be breached, it's more of a case of when, and unfortunately how badly. That's just unfortunately the world we live in at the moment. But so we know attacks are becoming more sophisticated and quite often, well, state sponsored, that they're not trivial matters. So we're seeing a lot of organizations adopt what we call a zero trust approach. And actually some customers are going even further and assuming a position or a posture where they assume they're already breached, which is, obviously quite an interesting stance to take. I guess this is where we come in, and the Microsoft technology that we use, we leverage for our customers to help protect them. Microsoft are currently recognized as the #1 identity and security provider on the planet, which I guess is no surprise given that they're investing over $1 billion per annum in cybersecurity. So if you look at that and look at the way us as a Microsoft partner and identity specialist can leverage that technology, I think we're in a really good position to help our organizations, our customer organizations, protect themselves. I'd add finally that if you look at the way Condatis employ things like Microsoft Secure Development Lifecycle, it means that we're building in security by design from the get-go. Security is not an afterthought.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, so it is, when are you being breached? Big bad world out there. David, from an architectural point, what security and privacy features can we leverage, and how can we help our clients provide their customers with a secure yet a usable system?
Yeah. Well, for service providers to be successful, it's important for them to understand their customers, to gather as much information about the customers as possible while preventing a barrier to entry and ensuring that the person presenting themselves to access a service is the genuine user. That can be through enhanced identity assurance. It's gathering additional information to strengthen the relationship with the customer. It could be applying different levels of authentication to protect more sensitive data. And of course, we talked about the use of Microsoft's built-in risk mitigation and threat identification. So preventing a barrier to entry is an interesting one, as service providers need to balance the desire to know as much as possible about their customers with the application of privacy principles such as the GDPR mandates to capture only necessary information, to make it clear what the information will be used for, and to hold it only for as long as is necessary. And there's also a common requirement to make the user experience as intuitive and streamlined as possible. And that can be from application of common branding, as we've mentioned, to ensure that new user journeys appear familiar. It can use progressive profiling to capture minimum required data on registration, but with the ability to capture additional information in subsequent journeys. And that can be when it's needed or as part of a gradual build-up, reducing the burden on the user of excessive data capture in a given journey, while still gaining the data so that it's available when it's needed. Registration of a device to be used for multi-factor authentication is a good example of this. An initial registration process for a free service might not need strong authentication credential, but progression to a paid-for service or the need to protect an increasingly large set of personal data might warrant a stronger authentication level. Having the ability to introduce the additional device registration or the data capture to support multi-factor authentication in a subsequent user journey as a way to reduce the initial registration burden, but still give the ability to provide a stronger level of protection by the time it's needed. And given this strong focus on security, the transition to support passwordless credentials is a hot topic. It reduces the possibility of account compromises through phishing attacks or password reuse across less secure sites. And as we said, Azure comes with its own built-in security measures to identify unusual traffic patterns. As we saw in the previous webinar, Microsoft risk scoring can be applied to take appropriate action if the system determines that a particular user session is risky. Dave, how do you see the application of this part in practice?
Yes, so again, it's making use of the flexibility that the custom policies give you, right? So you can think about the security aspects in terms of B2C gives you the ability to design security in essentially from the ground up. So you were talking about the custom styling there, right? Making sure that users get a journey and experience that they understand, that they implicitly trust, because it's using your branding, right? So you can configure B2C to use whatever custom branding you need it to use, so that when a user's sent there to authenticate, it's not like they're being sent to an external service, they're being sent to something that looks and feels familiar. They implicitly then trust that the fact that they're entering their details there is that they're giving their details to you to use, not to some random third party that they don't quite understand the relationship between them and you. That then moves on, like you say, to things like MFA. So B2C supports multiple MFA out the box, and you can do integrations to various other multi-factor authentications. So again, it's designing that into the policies. When should you prompt for MFA? Where do you need to prompt for MFA? How is all of that going to be configured? So it's just again about designing out your policies and saying, you know, these are the scenarios where we need to apply heightened security, or maybe we want to apply across the board. We're going to invoke MFA at this point. We're going to allow users to register with these particular types of MFA in this particular way. And that all ties into what we were showing in the previous webinar about the conditional access, where you can make use of the features of AAD in B2C using the custom policies, setting up your own conditional access policies to take into account things like the riskiness of the user, the riskiness of the sign-in, where the user's signing in from, what platforms they're using, all the different signals that we showed last time, to determine whether or not AAD thinks, based on those signals, the user needs an additional MFA check, whether they should be blocked or whether they should just be allowed in. So you kind of get that security all the way through the process, and you can apply it as and when you need to as part of your policy design. So we carry out some work for a global health insurance company doing just that. They had a number of different policies for doing sign-in, for doing registration, doing rights elevation. They had different services with different levels of sensitivity. So maybe some services needed a higher level of assurance that the user was who they said there was. So in those cases, what we do is we'd use the base signing policy, maybe extend it out with some MFA for the more sensitive areas, allow MFA for anything that needs rights elevation, or maybe even go as far as knowledge-based proof questions. So we have some information about the user and we ask them questions based on that as part of the authentication journey. If they answer correctly, they're allowed in. We're more assured that we know that they are who they say they are. And it could be any combination of those different factors that go towards saying this user is authenticated with a certain level of assurance that they are who they say they are. They are now allowed access to whatever it was that they just requested access to. And it's not just what's built into B2C, right? So it's not just the conditional access, it's not just the MFA and the custom branding. Because you can integrate with the various different third parties using API calls. So like we showed in the previous webinar with the Have I Been Pwned integration, where we were doing just a basic password validation check to check whether the password had been in a breach. You could hook those API calls into whatever you needed to, at whatever point you needed to make sure that the user was secure according to your requirements. So you can use that to support things like even WebAuthn or FIDO for Passwordless. It's entirely down to whatever you need that integration to do.
Thanks, Dave. David and Ian as well. So now we know why we at Condatis are repeatedly choosing the Microsoft stack for securing our customers' identity services. Great arguments and testament to this Microsoft identity platform. Investment that Microsoft doing just in identity, and that's threat detection, and the investment in their identity stack is just unparalleled in the market. However, when we start our engagement with our customers and a new customer, we never find what we call a greenfield site. There's always existing data pods, data items, as Ian said, siloed identity solutions somewhere. Back to Ian, when you first speak to our customers, what are those typical integration challenges and ecosystem challenges they're facing where we help them?
Yeah, it's another great question, Chris. I think it's fair to say we see our fair share of complexity here at Condatis when it comes to helping customers with their digital transformation of those existing ecosystems. I think, if I'm honest, though, that's what we really enjoy. I see the team here get really, really excited when they're working with a big customer, a really complex setting. How we're going to approach it, figuring the design out, and then obviously delivering the project through integration. It's the stuff that we get out of bed for, so it's really exciting. I think if I was to pick 3 areas that I see time and time again, which if you like, are more complicated and need a good level of detail going into those existing ecosystems. Things like single sign-on, David's talked about it already, but everyone wants to provide their customers with that seamless user experience across multiple products and services. But quite often we're integrating both legacy and new applications with a range of different protocols, which the guys have talked to. So single sign-on's one. The other one, and it's a big one, is user migration. So, okay, we're going to take a customer from their old world to this new world. But what does the user see when they sign in for the first time? Now, we work with some customers and they will want the experience to be seamless, almost silent, in terms of when the customer signs in for the first time, don't ask them to do anything. For example, don't force them to change a password. Don't almost disturb that user experience, keep them as they are. But on the other hand, we see customers who are maybe they're conscious of, weak security, weak passwords, etc., where they say, no, absolutely, this is an opportunity where we can force a password reset to a higher level, or we could introduce multi-factor authentication, which again has been talked of, and that could be knowledge-based questions, it could be SMS, it could be the authenticator app, for example. And sorry, I can just see the slides playing around. And I think with those two different approaches, we can advise clients on the pros and cons of each one. There's no right choice. It's what works for you and your customers ultimately. And I think I was to choose the third option that I see a lot is that integration with a CRM tool. So again, the guys have talked and called a couple of them out. That could be Dynamics 365, Salesforce, and others. And quite often we will get involved in not only how that CRM tool is integrated, and as David said, maybe there's like a golden record, etc. But it could be that you use the CRM tool to actually initiate, a sign up, for example. So they're the three things that we tend to see on going into those sort of existing complex ecosystems. Back to you.
Thanks, Ian. Great highlighting your top 3 integration challenges. David, from your architectural level again and the architectural experience, can you share your insights in these integration challenges?
Yeah, so for all the points that have just been mentioned, it's really important to use a collaborative approach across the complete life cycle of the project. So from development of a strategy through application of quality processes, through to knowledge transfer, delivery of project documentation, support through go live and beyond to ensure the success of the project. Given some of the challenges that we've just highlighted, it's neither sensible nor reasonable to attempt to design and deliver a system in isolation and then simply hand it over as a done deal. It's really important that our clients are completely happy with the proposed solution and the design, particularly given that they're likely to be providing first-line support to their customers. So understanding how the system operates, where they can gain access to important data, whether that's customers' personal data or audit logs, telemetry data, to allow health monitoring, traceability of past transactions, all of that's critical. And we come back to the fact that our clients' systems are continually evolving through growth or acquisition or introduction of new services or indeed new regulations. So through production of the strategy and from developing an early view of the required system, we can model the data to be held about the customers and help to determine the most suitable storage location for that data. As Dave mentioned earlier, that might be in B2C's own Active Directory record. That makes it instantly available during authentication and authorization flows. But for larger systems and for systems that are intended to support a multitude of different services, it's often more suitable to store the data in what's often termed a golden record, a single source of truth about the customer. And that's capable of supporting diverse services and also for allowing customer management operations to be performed, whether by the customer themselves or perhaps by service provider support staff. But as Dave mentioned, it's not always sensible to store everything in one location. Some services might have some very specific requirements for additional customer data or for access rights. So identifying the genuinely common data for central storage and then the service-specific data for more local storage can help to provide a more robust resultant system. Getting that split right then simplifies the ability to support single sign-on across services based on service-specific needs. And given what Chris said about us rarely starting with a blank sheet of paper, the common requirement is to determine how to make use of data that's already held about customers. So a migration strategy is often a key step. That needs to balance the capabilities of the legacy system, the quality of the data stored, with the required data that we've identified and the agreed data storage. so that we can make the transition from the old system to the new system as painless as possible and as seamless for the end users as possible. And part of that includes being able to verify the identity of the customer who's being migrated. That's either through authentication against the legacy system or perhaps through use of some knowledge-based questions associated with the existing service. And when we're talking about larger systems, the location of the data becomes ever more important to ensure that response times are acceptable for geographically distributed users and that any country-specific or sector-specific regulations can be met. So Dave, how do we see this filtering through into the development effort for the transition of existing services?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's really, again, about the flexibility that you can get out of the policies, right, and making use of that and making use of the right policy designs. So we were talking in the previous question about customizing your front end using the custom styling that B2C supports to give users a consistent look and feel, right? Now, it might be that in this case, if you've got multiple systems being onboarded over time, you want to provide users with a gradual change to their look and feel. So maybe during a migration, you want them to feel like they're leaving the old system and coming onto a new system. So you can make use of the custom styling in very focused ways to give them that look and feel. So they don't just feel like the system's been replaced with a new one. They feel like they're actually going through a transition. So again, it depends on your users, it depends on what you're trying to do, but B2C allows you to be flexible to do that kind of thing. It's not just an all or one. You're either on the old system or you're on the new system. You can, kind of tailor it to your needs. You also talked about SSO there. So again, SSO isn't just an all or nothing thing. You could have certain services which all share a single session. So if a user signed into one, they can effectively be signed into multiple other systems without needing to be reprompted for their credentials. But maybe there are some systems that live in isolation. They still use the same credential, they still use the same set of policies, effectively the same data store, but they don't share a single sign-on session. The user's reprompted to sign in every time, maybe because it's a more secure system or it contains more sensitive data. So again, it's making use of that flexibility, planning out what your users need to do, and then designing your policies around that. And again, it comes back to you can add whatever API integrations you need to do. So you might have a standard set of integrations that happen as part of the main journey, but then as you onboard a new service, maybe you need to make a new call to a new API to supplement the user information with something that's specific to that service. So you can do that conditionally as part of the policies. It's not just this single monolithic thing where you're forced down a set of railroad tracks and everyone has to conform or live with it. You can be very flexible depending on what you need that logic to be. So you could even integrate with something like, say, identity verification. So maybe you onboard a service that needs a greater level of assurance that the user is who they say they are. It's the first service that needs that. So when the user tries to sign in to that service the first time, they're prompted to go through an identity verification check, and that could be using something like, I don't know, Onfido is a fairly popular one, completely third party, completely kind of outside of B2C, but B2C will integrate with it for whichever journeys, whichever services you need it to integrate with. And we don't talk about it a lot, it kind of gets taken for granted, but the fact that B2C is standards compliant, right? It supports OpenID and SAML essentially out of the box. You don't need to worry about implementing either of those protocols. B2C does it for you. It just allows you to configure the parameters that go into it. So you don't have to worry, am I implementing this correctly? Am I implementing SAML correctly? Is there anything insecure about what I'm doing at the protocol level? That's all taken care of. You can focus just on the journey logic that you need to focus on to implement, whatever service it is that you're onboarding, whatever system it is that you're building. When it comes to getting the actual data in to start with, whether that's like your initial setup of the system or whether it's onboarding a new service, there's Graph API if you want to do a bulk migration. So you could take everyone out of your old service and then move them into the new service. There's just-in-time migrations that you can do. So again, making use of these API integrations and the flexibility, the validation in the custom policies to go off to an external system, check the user's details in there when they try and sign into B2C, and then if they're in that system, if the details they're provided are correct, maybe at that point you create the record in B2C and migrate them across at that point. There's all different ways of doing migration. There's benefits to doing it ahead of time. There's benefits to doing it just in time, depending on your existing user base, who you want to carry forward, what kind of information you've got. So particularly with passwords, we see this, right? So a very common misconception is because you don't know the password in the old system, because it's hashed, rightly so, you can't get that back. You then can't take that forward into B2C, so the user has to reset their password. Well, that's not entirely true, right? Because when the user's signing into B2C, we capture a password as part of that. So as long as we can either connect to the old system and compare that password that they've just entered in B2C to the old system, or we can rehash it and compare it to the hashed value that we've copied across into B2C, then we know that that user is correct from the old system. We know their password because they've entered it as part of the UI, and we can do a just-in-time migration of just the password at that point. So you can be very granular and very flexible to give these seamless migrations that Ian was talking about, so that you're doing, in this case, just the password part just in time.
Great, Dave. I like how you always come back to the flexibility of B2C and custom policies. You know, this seems to be your message of today, as you say, you know, but that's the whole essence. We've now worked with Microsoft and their B2C engineering team for more than 6 years. In this time, B2C has matured and grown up as a service. As we heard, Condatis has done this first UK production implementation for Nuffield 6 years ago, and you know that was on the previous still. Since then, a lot has happened in the identity world, and I wanted to pick out 4 things where identity is changing. The first thing I wanted to pick up is compliance. And compliance is around the whole privacy legislation, so GDPR. Also Privacy Act in the UK. And there's a few compliance features in B2C that not a lot of organizations are using yet. One is controlling access for minors. You know, you need to, under privacy legislation, you know, control access to people underage. How do you know they are underage? So first of all, it is that checking of the birth date, so you can determine that, but actually a minor definition legally is different depending on the geography. So B2C has this lookup built in that allows you to check, oh, you need to be 18 in the UK and the date of birth is older than 18, so you can allow in or out. The other possibility is to actually have this holding pattern where minors need additional parental consent. Parents with an adult age can log in and approve the minor's access. So that's 2 features to comply there. The other thing on GDPR is this rights to be forgotten. And we have the log storage in Azure that logs information about the user, and we have the user data as well. And by default, to comply, Microsoft Azure log is limited to 7 days. But so that complies out of the box, really. But if a user asks for the right to be forgotten, you can also use an API call to forget them even quicker than that. On the other side, there's business requirement potential that you need to actually keep user data longer. And basically, you can take the data that is in B2C and in Azure and export it into external data. But you're taking the liability then to manage that whole data liability, and you're then liable for managing the rights to be forgotten. But it is very easily possible now. The other topic I wanted to talk to is passwordless. You know, Dave mentioned, Ian mentioned it. It is something that we are getting quite used to in the staff identity. You know, every organization is protecting their staff, and you know, authenticate the apps are becoming norm. We're getting tokens from our banks because they need to comply to regulations, and you know, we need to enter this two-factor thing. Well, actually, it is fairly simple to also onboard tokens or authenticate the app within B2C. It is a journey that needs registration, so you need to register such a device or token, and a token is nothing more than a secret that the identity provider B2C shares with the user. In this way, it's a hardware token, but an authenticator app, it's a software token. So it's a secret that is shared, and based on that secret, there's an algorithm, a time-based one-time password algorithm that calculates this running timer that you see in Authenticator app that gives you a new 6-digit number every 30 seconds, 60 seconds, however it's configured. And we can do this very simply in B2C because all the browsers now, and we didn't have that 6 years ago, support a protocol called WebAuthn, which is really a way of triggering an authentication, a generic authentication call from a web browser, and use another standard which is called CTAP, the client to authenticate a protocol, that allows an off-channel communication, and I can trigger from a browser to an authenticator app a back-channel call to sign something, and I can compare the signature back on the identity provider. So I can use FIDO keys, for example. You know, this is called Fast Identity Online. There's FIDO 2. It's built in for staff identity already, but you know, for B2C we need to do an onboarding flow, but it is possible now, and this is really coming to the consumers as well now. The other topic is around threat and risk management. Dave, you mentioned in one of the previous webinars this whole concept of conditional access, how it's actually built into B2C that to calculate risks for built-in users. Now there's actually a few enhancements, and Microsoft published a new service called the Microsoft Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection Service that allows you to, in addition to those, find out where the user is. Is that normal that the user is in China or in the UK or travels between the UK and China? The other service in there is device fingerprinting, something we are used from device management, mobile device management in the corporate sector, again with our staff, where a staff enrolls a device to their staff identity. For a consumer, I wouldn't to enroll my device with all the shopping channels that there are, but I could allow this dynamic protection service to device fingerprint my device. So just by binding this fingerprint, I know next time I'm appearing, it is still my device and I haven't changed device. So that's a service that's now available and also integratable into B2C, the fraud protection service. And my last service I wanted to call out is around decentralizing. That's the last new thing. It is following this whole concept of, you know, I have more rights to my data. That was the whole drive behind GDPR. And there's different models around how I can actually hold control to all my data and only give access to the relevant applications. And one of those things is actually decentralized identity. And there's a new data model of verifiable credential that's allowing us to share data and share it only selectively with whoever we want. And me as a data owner being able to consent to that data share. Now, that's a whole topic in itself, and we have a series of webinars there. But think about you having your driving license digitally on your phone and being able to book a rental car and validate that you have a driving license and you have no endorsement on it, and that you live at this address and you can pay and all of this, and you book it online and you only pick up your rental car maybe with a digital key only, and you never even need to queue at the counter. So that's where this is going. Decentralized identity. If you're interested, there's a whole channel on this on the Condatis YouTube channel, because we run a seminar on decentralized. The next decentralized seminar, 14th of April, so please sign up if you're interested in this. So from what's coming next, back to the questions that might have arisen from the audience, and back to David.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Okay, why should we come to you rather than doing this ourselves? Okay, it's a fair question. Over the past 6 months, I guess we've demonstrated that B2C can hopefully do pretty much anything you want. We've given you some examples on how to do it. There are some tutorials. So I guess, well, I don't guess, the difference is it's the experience we've gained in how to do it properly, to do it well. It's the good use of policy hierarchies. It's the additional security that we're building and the security around securing APIs for API calls. It's tailoring the journeys to your needs, to future-proof them, to make sure they're performant, to make them flexible enough. It's, as Ian mentioned, we use secure development lifecycle as a default part of our development process. It's the whole hand-holding process from defining a strategy right through go live and beyond, being able to support, providing documentation to make sure the service can be supported. Threat modeling, we apply threat modeling. It's the security, it's the processes that we follow, and automated testing. It's all the stuff that goes beyond just the ability to make some B2C policies handle what you need functionally. It's making sure your system actually will work today and in future. That, I think, is why you should come to Condatis. Okay, what's needed for a properly international system? Dave, this is in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, okay, so from a dev point of view, I guess. So the thing that's probably going to be most obvious to the users would be the localization. So making sure that the pages, the B2C displays are rendered in the language based on the user's culture, right? So that might be English for English people, Japanese, Chinese, you know, so on and so on and so on. That can be defined in the B2C policies, or you can do it as kind of a custom solution that applies it to the pages based on some externally managed data store. And you know, we've done either way. On from that, you've probably then got to consider kind of a globally distributed infrastructure, right? If you've got different people in different parts of the world accessing the system, then you're going to want the content and the APIs to be local to those users so that there's no lag as they go through their authentication process. So that might be making use of CDNs, it might be making use of traffic management, having various resources positioned strategically in whatever infrastructure you've got them positioned in. So we use Azure, so that they're locally available to the various different callers, right? You've then probably got to consider data locality, right? So you've got your pages being rendered in the right language for the user. You've got content and data and API calls being made from the right location so that it's fast for the user. But where is specifically the data for that user, I suppose, but probably data generally, going to be stored and where's it going to come from? You've got the same problem as with the globally distributed architecture, the infrastructure, where you want the directories that the user's details are coming from to be close to the user, so there's no lag. You've also got to consider things like compliance and local laws. So like I think you mentioned earlier, GDPR. So do you need certain users' data to be stored in certain regions because it allows you to comply with laws that affect those users based on where they're living, where they're coming from. So those are probably the three main things. I mean, like you just mentioned, you kind of add on to that all of the testing and the actual architecture. So not just making sure that you've got things that are globally distributed, but you've got failover set up and all your network configurations correct, and you're testing it all and all the rest of it, everything that goes into building a system of that scale, testing a system of that scale, and so on. But yeah, localization, distribution, and data locality, I guess you'd call it.
Brilliant, thanks, Dave. Okay, that's it. Those were the questions that were submitted. So, Ian, over to you.
Well, thank you, Dave. Well, I guess I'd like to wrap up this webinar. In fact, the webinar series by thanking yourself, David and Chris, and thank you, the audience, for joining us this afternoon. We've covered quite a bit. So you've heard today that the Condatis team have got a wealth of experience in designing and implementing those systems, those large-scale customer identity systems. And as we've just heard from Chris a few minutes ago, the world of identity, customer identity and access management is transforming faster than ever before. So there's never been a better time to prioritize it as part of your digital transformation. I guess moving forward, we're more than happy to take any other questions outside of this webinar. You can reach us on our company email address, info@condatis.com. You can also reach all of us on LinkedIn as well. More than happy to receive questions outside of today. And in fact, you might, if you think it's going to be useful, wish to have a discovery introductory call with us here at Condatis, and we can see how we can help you on your identity journey. So before we close, finally, we'd like to hear what you thought of this webinar and this webinar series. We'd like to know whether you like this content, whether you'd like something a bit different. Your feedback is really, really appreciated. So do let us know what you think. And so that's it for this session. So until next time, thank you. Good luck on your identity journey, and goodbye for now.